night was alive with thunder. Heavy clouds pressed down on the sprawling city, blotting out the stars, while the streets shimmered with puddles reflecting the cold glow of streetlights. It was the kind of night when even the boldest men hurried indoors, yet a single Rolls-Royce Phantom glided silently through the deserted road like a black shark in an ocean of rain. Inside the car sat Alexander Cole, Billionaire CEO, his sharp eyes fixed on the glowing screen of his phone as he reviewed business deals worth billions. Every inch of his life was measured, controlled, and calculated. The world knew him as untouchable, a man whose heart was as polished and cold as the marble floors of his mansion. But the city outside had other stories playing out, stories that cared nothing for power or wealth. As the car approached a stretch of highway known for flooding, the storm intensified. Raindrops battered the tinted windows like small stones, and the wipers cut rhythmic arcs across the glass. The driver, a seasoned man used to Alexander's silence, slowed to navigate the swirling water gathering on the asphalt. Then, through the curtain of rain and mist, a shape emerged. A lone figure staggered under a broken streetlight, her silhouette barely visible. She was barefoot, soaked to the skin, and clutching something in front of her, a round, swollen belly. For a moment, Alexander thought it was a hallucination. The woman's clothes clung to her like a second skin, her hair plastered to her face. She stumbled again, collapsing briefly against a lamppost before dragging herself forward. The Rolls-Royce drew closer, its headlights cutting through the storm. And then it became painfully clear. She was in labor, her body racked with visible contractions. This was not the kind of scene Alexander Cole was used to. His world was one of boardrooms, private jets, and offshore accounts, not rain-soaked streets and desperate strangers. But something ancient, something human, stirred deep within him. He had built empires, crushed competitors, and survived corporate wars, yet here stood a simple moment that stripped away all of it. The car rolled to a stop. The sound of the rain grew louder as the engine hummed. In that moment, Alexander could feel the weight of the storm, the smell of wet asphalt, and the trembling urgency of life hanging by a thread. The woman doubled over, clutching her belly, her knees buckling under the strain. The rain beat down on her mercilessly, turning the street into a river of mud and runoff. Her lips moved silently as though praying, but no one could hear her. Alexander's eyes flicked to the road ahead, empty. Then back to the woman, weak, vulnerable, and seconds away from collapse. A lifetime of instincts screamed for him to look away, to keep moving, to let someone else handle it. Yet another voice, quieter but stronger, rose from deep inside, the voice of conscience. And at that very moment, something inside the billionaire cracked. The door swung open, and for the first time in years, Alexander Cole stepped willingly into the storm. The rain swallowed his expensive suit, flattening his hair, soaking his shoes, but he didn't care. He moved toward the woman, the sound of his own heartbeat thundering louder than the rain itself. As she slumped forward, he caught her before she hit the ground. Her body was trembling with exhaustion, her skin cold under the downpour. In his arms, she felt weightless and yet impossibly heavy, as if the burden of 2 lives hung suspended in his grasp. For a fleeting moment, the billionaire who thought he owned the world stood helpless, holding something far more powerful than money, a life yet to be born. He carried her toward the car, each step splashing through deep puddles. The driver scrambled to open the door, his face pale with shock. The warmth of the Rolls-Royce wrapped around them as Alexander eased her inside, but the storm still howled outside, as if protesting this act of unexpected mercy. Without a word, he gestured for the hospital. The car surged forward, cutting through the rain like a bullet through mist. In the dim glow of the dashboard lights, Alexander looked at the woman and her unborn child, realizing this moment would change everything he thought he knew about himself. Rainwater still clung to the marble steps of St. Helena's private hospital as the black Rolls-Royce screeched to a halt under the canopy of the emergency entrance. The hospital glowed in the storm like a fortress of glass and steel, its white lights spilling onto the wet pavement. Alexander moved with uncharacteristic urgency, carrying the unconscious woman through the automatic doors. Nurses rushed forward, startled by the sight of a billionaire CEO drenched in rain, his arms full of a stranger. They whisked her away toward the maternity wing, leaving Alexander standing in the lobby, his expensive suit clinging like a second skin. For years, Alexander had been the master of his own universe. But here, stripped of his boardroom armor and left alone under flickering hospital lights, he felt something foreign, helplessness. He paced the sterile corridor, his shoes squeaking on the polished floor, each second dragging like an hour. Beyond the double doors, doctors worked furiously. Machines beeped, surgical gloves snapped, and the air hummed with urgency. Alexander glimpsed flashes of green scrubs and stainless steel through the small window, but nothing more. He hated not being in control, hated the way his heart hammered at the sound of a stranger's pain. Then, amid the storm outside, a new sound pierced the corridor, soft but powerful, rising above the thunder. The first cries of a newborn. It cut through Alexander's chest like a blade, sharp and strangely warm. He hadn't expected it, but the sound rooted him to the spot, igniting a sense of awe he hadn't felt in decades. Moments later, a nurse emerged to report the baby was alive, the mother stable. Relief flooded through Alexander like a wave, though he couldn't explain why. He sat down on a bench he'd never have touched in his normal life, his hands trembling as water dripped from his hair to the polished floor. Hours later, a nurse handed him the hospital bill and preliminary documents. He glanced at the form, expecting nothing unusual, until a name stopped him cold. Isabella Gray. The name hissed like a ghost from his past. Isabella Gray, daughter of Jonathan Gray, the powerful business magnate who had once controlled half of West Africa's shipping lanes. Jonathan Gray, whose empire had crumbled months ago in a scandal whispered to have been engineered by one man, Alexander Cole. Images flooded his mind, newspaper headlines, boardroom rumors, secret deals sealed behind closed doors. Back then, it had been nothing but strategy. But now, standing in a hospital corridor watching the rain streak down the windows, he realized the collateral damage of his ambition had faces. And one of those faces had just given birth under his protection. A feeling Alexander had never known before began to stir. Guilt mixed with inevitability, as though the universe had planned this confrontation long before either of them was born. He watched from a distance as the nurses wheeled Isabella's bed past the corridor toward recovery. She was pale but alive, her eyes closed, the newborn bundled against her chest. She did not know he was there, nor did she know who had saved her. Yet as they passed, her features flickered under the fluorescent light, a faint resemblance to her father, the man Alexander once brought low. It was a haunting echo, a living testament to the past catching up with him. As the doors shut behind them, Alexander remained frozen, staring at the name on the clipboard. Rain pounded against the hospital windows, as if the storm outside and the storm within him had become one. He had arrived at this hospital a savior. He now stood there a man confronted by his sins. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in the city like a bruise. Streets still glistened with puddles, and the morning light fell pale and heavy through hospital windows. Inside St. Helena's private hospital, the scent of antiseptic and rain mixed in the air, creating a strange calm after the chaos of the night before. Alexander Cole stood at the edge of the maternity ward, separated from the room by a glass pane. He had not slept. His shirt from the night before was wrinkled, his hair still damp. For the first time in decades, the billionaire's appearance was uncurated. No tailored suit, no rehearsed composure. Inside the room, Isabella Gray lay propped up on a hospital bed, her newborn tucked against her chest. Nurses moved quietly, checking 4 lines, adjusting blankets, writing notes. The faint hum of machines underscored the scene. Alexander's eyes fixed not on Isabella, but on the infant, small, fragile, but carrying an aura of mystery he could not explain. The baby's fingers were curled into fists the size of marbles, its skin soft and new, but it was the eyes that struck him first. Hazel brown. It was a color so rare, so distinctive, Alexander could count on one hand the number of people he had ever met with it, including himself. He had seen those eyes every morning in the mirror. He had seen them months ago, at a gala where a young Isabella Gray had stood under a chandelier, her dress shimmering like midnight silk. He remembered the fleeting glances they exchanged then, the single night that followed, a night he had filed away in his memory as insignificant. Now those same eyes stared back at him from the face of a newborn. A cold tremor ran through his veins. The possibility was absurd, yet it grew heavier with each passing second. The child's existence, Isabella's name, the timing, the eyes, all threads weaving together into a tapestry of truth Alexander wasn't ready to face. He turned away from the glass, pacing the corridor, his shoes echoing against the sterile tiles. His mind raced with calculations, like a chessboard he could not control. Every empire he built was founded on control and foresight, yet here was a situation that defied both. He tried to tell himself it was coincidence. Genetics, chance, nothing more. But the memory of that night months ago clawed its way up. Isabella's laughter under chandeliers, the warmth of champagne, the reckless abandon of two strangers whose paths were never meant to cross again. Alexander's chest tightened. Could this child be his? His rational mind reached for solutions. He called one of his private doctors under the guise of a medical donation. He arranged for routine testing and offered to cover all the hospital bills indefinitely. He told himself it was charity, that it was about protecting the child, but deep down he knew it was about confirming a suspicion he dared not voice. Later that day, a nurse came to collect a small blood sample from the baby for newborn screening. Alexander turned away as the needle pricked the infant's heel. His heart hammered louder than he liked. This was not how billionaires operated. This was how frightened men acted, men who had something to lose. When he left the hospital that evening, the sun was already low, casting long golden rays across the parking lot. Alexander sat in the back of his car, his hands clasped tightly, his mind a storm of memories and fears. For the first time since he was a boy, he did not think of contracts, profits, or rival companies. He thought of bloodlines, of faces, of a child who might carry his name without ever knowing it. The city moved around him, unaware that one of its most powerful men was unraveling inside a luxury car. As the car merged into traffic, Alexander stared at his reflection in the tinted window, those same hazel-brown eyes staring back at him. He whispered silently to himself, though no one could hear. What if? In his penthouse overlooking the city, Alexander Cole sat at a glass table surrounded by contracts he could no longer read. His empire moved on autopilot, meetings held without him, deals signed in his absence, but he remained consumed by a single question. Was the child his? He replayed everything in his mind. The gala months ago, Isabella's sudden disappearance, her father's downfall, and now the birth under the storm. The timeline was too precise to ignore. And those eyes had burned through his defenses. He had already set his plan in motion. Under the guise of routine testing, his private medical team had collected a discrete sample from the newborn. It was a quiet operation, executed with the same precision he used to dismantle companies. Yet this wasn't a hostile takeover. This was something far more intimate, a test of blood and legacy. 3 days later, an envelope arrived at his private office, sealed and stamped. His assistant left it on his desk, unaware of its significance. Alexander dismissed everyone from the room and locked the door. The city pulsed far below, skyscrapers glittering like steel spires. But inside the office all sound died except for the paper tearing under his fingers. 2 sheets. Black ink. Cold science. The words jumped at him. Paternity. 99.8% match. He stared at the paper for a long time, unmoving. The weight of his empire felt like dust compared to the weight of those words. The world's most ruthless dealmaker, the man who had crushed monopolies, tamed governments, and bent markets to his will, now sat paralyzed by a piece of paper. He walked to the window, the skyline reflected in the glass like 1,000 broken stars. In his reflection, the hazel-brown eyes glowed under the city's neon. For the first time in years, he felt small. Down below, rain began again, a slow drizzle against the streets. He thought of Isabella in her modest hospital room, holding their child, oblivious to the storm of power and guilt swirling around them. His mind raced. This changed everything. This wasn't just a stranger's baby. It was his blood, his name, his future. Yet she hated him, believing he had destroyed her family. Alexander knew he couldn't reveal the truth yet. Not like this. Not while she still looked at him as the enemy. He needed a plan, but this time, it wasn't about acquisition or control. It was about survival, emotional survival. He sat back at his desk, staring at the paternity test like it might rearrange itself. The paper trembled in his grip, and he realized it wasn't the paper shaking, it was his own hands. For years, his life had been defined by strategy and precision. But this was chaos, raw and human. There was no boardroom to conquer, no rival to outsmart. This was life in its most primal form, a child whose mere existence could dismantle his empire and yet also redeem him. Outside the window, thunder rolled again, low and distant, like a warning drumbeat. Alexander's reflection flickered under the neon, a man caught between the ghost of who he was and the father he might become. He folded the paper slowly, slid it into a leather folder, and locked it in his safe. The sound of the lock clicking echoed in the office like a verdict. Isabella sat upright in the narrow bed, the baby pressed to her chest. The world outside had moved on since that night in the storm, but inside her small room time had grown sharp and thin. Each hour was a needle of uncertainty. Alexander had continued paying the hospital bills anonymously, sending premium formula and expensive clothing through intermediaries. Yet he never entered her room again. From her window she would sometimes see his convoy parked across the street. Black cars, tinted windows, silent men in suits. He was watching, waiting. Rumors began to spread through the hospital staff. Who was this mysterious benefactor? Why did a billionaire CEO care so deeply about a single mother with no visible connections? Isabella heard the whispers and tightened her grip on her baby. Then came the first move. A man in a crisp grey suit arrived with official papers, temporary guardianship for medical reasons, stamped with the logo of one of Alexander's subsidiaries. Isabella tore the papers to pieces before the man could leave the room, but it didn't matter. She had seen enough to know what was coming. She began hiding, leaving the hospital at night, moving between friends' apartments, keeping the baby wrapped and close, like a secret the world wanted to steal. But everywhere she went, the black cars found her. Sometimes they parked a street away, sometimes across from a grocery store, but always there, watching. Alexander, meanwhile, was unraveling. In his penthouse, board members and investors demanded explanations for his absences. Journalists began sniffing around, piecing together the story of Isabella Gray, the fallen heiress linked to the billionaire. The stock price trembled. A scandal was brewing, and his rivals smelled blood. Yet none of it mattered to him as much as the child. His legacy. He watched Isabella flee from one apartment to another, watched her grow thinner and more frantic, and he felt the old habits, the strategist's instincts, taking over again. This wasn't business, but he treated it like one. Every move she made became a data point. Every route she took was mapped. Then, one rainy night, Isabella found an envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a glossy photograph, Alexander standing beside a stroller in a park, smiling down at a baby she instantly recognized as hers. The image was a knife, proof that he could reach them anytime, anywhere. No words, no threats, just the photograph. Isabella crumpled the picture and held her baby closer. The war had shifted from hidden to open. She contacted a lawyer, one of the few left from her father's circle of allies. Within days, court papers were filed accusing Alexander of harassment, intimidation, and coercion. It hit the press immediately. Fallen heiress battles billionaire over secret child. The story went viral. News vans camped outside the hospital. Commentators speculated on paternity, revenge, and scandal. Alexander responded with silence. No interviews, no statements. But inside his penthouse, he prepared a counterattack, legal, financial, personal. His lawyers drafted motions claiming he had provided financial support for months, that the mother was unstable, that the child was at risk. Custody, they argued, should be awarded to him. The case became a spectacle. Protesters stood outside the courthouse with signs calling him a predator, a savior, a thief, a father, each headline louder than the last. Isabella arrived hidden under scarves, her baby shielded from cameras. Alexander stepped from his convoy in an immaculate suit, his face unreadable, every move calculated. Inside the courtroom, cameras were banned. But the world still watched as two people stood on opposite sides of a silent battlefield, one fueled by maternal desperation, the other by guilt and power. And yet, beneath the polished surface of his legal war, Alexander felt something cracking. The more he tried to control the narrative, the more the narrative controlled him. Isabella's pain replayed in his mind. The storm, the eyes of the newborn, the paternity test locked in his safe. For the first time in his life, the billionaire who always won every battle began to wonder. In this war, even if he won on paper, would he lose everything that mattered? Outside, thunder rolled over the city again, as if the sky itself knew the fight wasn't over. The real storm hadn't even begun. The courtroom lights flickered as flashbulbs popped outside. 2 months into the custody battle, the billionaire and the fallen heiress had become the city's obsession. Every day was another hearing, another headline, another piece of both their lives stripped bare. But beneath the surface, another story was quietly forming, one that neither lawyers nor journalists had fully uncovered yet. Isabella's lawyer had hired an investigative team, digging deep into financial records, offshore accounts, and leaked emails. For weeks, nothing surfaced. Then, one late night, a former board member from her father's company reached out. He had been silenced for years but now was ready to talk. A thin folder arrived at Isabella's apartment, sealed in brown paper. She opened it slowly, the baby asleep in a bassinet nearby. Inside were documents stamped with Alexander Cole's signature, contracts, wire transfers, and shell company directives from months ago. They traced the money and the strategy that had collapsed her father's empire. She saw the pattern: hostile acquisitions disguised as rescues, regulatory pressure orchestrated through quiet lobbying, key board members bribed to betray her father. It wasn't a scandal or an accident. It had been a surgical strike, executed by one man with the precision of a predator. Alexander Cole. The man now suing for custody of her child had not only ruined her father but had also made himself the shadow architect of her downfall. Isabella's hands trembled as she turned the pages. In the glow of the single lamp, her face hardened from grief to resolve. The child stirred in its sleep. She realized the war had been built on a lie far larger than she'd imagined, not just about paternity, but about the destruction of her entire family. Across the city, Alexander stood in his penthouse, watching the stock ticker on a muted television. He had sensed the shift days ago, the way Isabella's lawyer had begun to hint at larger issues, the subtle changes in the press coverage. He knew the documents would surface eventually. He had buried them, but nothing stayed buried forever. He poured himself a drink, his hand steady despite the storm brewing in his mind. 4 years, he had justified his actions as business. Necessary moves on a board too large to feel personal. But now it was personal. The child sleeping somewhere across the city tied him to the very family he'd dismantled. And then came the moment of detonation. The next morning, a national newspaper published the leak. Documents reveal billionaire Alexander Cole engineered Grey Empire collapse. Screens around the city lit up with his name, his face, and the headline. News anchors replayed clips of him entering and exiting court, overlaying graphics of money trails and timelines. Protesters swelled outside his corporate headquarters, chanting Isabella's name. His board called an emergency meeting. Investors threatened to pull billions. Sponsors cut ties overnight. In 48 hours, Alexander Cole went from untouchable titan to pariah. Isabella, meanwhile, didn't celebrate. She packed her child's clothes into a small bag and moved again. She knew Alexander was dangerous even now, perhaps more dangerous than ever. But she also knew the balance of power had shifted. For the first time, he had something to lose. At night, alone in her safe apartment, she stared at her baby and thought about the storm that had begun everything. The man who had saved her under the rain was the same man who had destroyed her family. And yet, that man was also the father of her child. Somewhere deep inside, under layers of betrayal and rage, she wondered if redemption was even possible. or if they were both locked into a cycle of ruin they couldn't escape. Back at his penthouse, Alexander watched the city through glass. The rain was back again, harder this time, streaking the windows in long silver knives. His empire was crumbling, his reputation shredded. Yet in the wreckage, only one thought consumed him: his child. He walked to the safe, opened it, and stared at the paternity test one more time. His reflection glinted in the polished steel, a powerful man brought low not by competitors or governments, but by a baby born under a storm. Thunder rolled, the sound of something old breaking apart. Isabella arrived first, shielded under umbrellas, her lawyer close by, the baby hidden from cameras. Outside, protesters waved signs, journalists shouted questions, and camera flashes painted the air in white bursts. Her eyes stayed forward. Inside her coat pocket, she carried the folder of evidence, the documents that had destroyed Alexander's reputation and saved her from his control. Alexander arrived minutes later. Gone were the immaculate suits and unshakable demeanor. His tie was loose, his face drawn, his convoy smaller than before. The world had taken its pound of flesh. Yet he still moved like a man with purpose, a man who had something left to fight for. Inside the courtroom, tension clung to the walls. Judges whispered. Clerks fumbled with files. Reporters scribbled notes even though cameras were banned. The air smelled of wet coats and electricity, as if the storm outside had leaked into the room. For the first time since the night of the rain, Isabella and Alexander locked eyes. No words passed between them, but something heavier than words moved across the space. A history of ruin, a night of unexpected kindness, a baby who bore both their eyes. The proceedings began. Lawyers spoke in measured tones, but the emotion beneath their words trembled like a fault line. They argued over custody, over the child's future, over Alexander's fitness as a father. Isabella's side presented the documents again, this time officially entered into evidence. Proof of his role in her father's destruction, proof of his manipulation. Alexander's lawyers countered with evidence of his support, his wealth, his ability to provide. They painted Isabella as unstable, transient, endangered. But even as they spoke, Alexander sat silent, his eyes fixed on the baby, as though the entire courtroom were just a blur around that small heartbeat. Then the storm broke. Outside, rain lashed against the courthouse windows, rattling the glass. Thunder rolled so close it seemed to shake the floor. Inside, Isabella's lawyer delivered the closing argument. A story of betrayal and power, of a man who thought he could control lives like pieces on a board, and of a woman who refused to be a pawn. And then something happened no one expected. Alexander stood. Not at his lawyer's prompting. Not as a tactic. He simply stood, his chair scraping the floor, and reached into his briefcase. From it, he removed the original paternity test, the one no one but he had seen. He walked across the courtroom and handed it to the judge himself. The room went silent except for the storm. The judge read the document. Reporters leaned forward. Isabella's breath caught. It was the truth. Official. Undeniable. Alexander Cole was the father. The courtroom shifted like a living thing, whispers erupting into gasps. Isabella felt her knees weaken under the weight of it. She had suspected, but seeing it written in ink under a judge's gaze changed everything. Alexander didn't speak. He simply returned to his seat, his eyes lowered, his hands clasped. In that moment, stripped of power, wealth, and control, he looked not like a billionaire but like a man awaiting a sentence he already knew he deserved. The judge recessed the court for deliberation. People rose, murmuring, shuffling. Outside, sirens wailed as the rain intensified. Isabella walked to the window, her baby in her arms. For the first time, she saw Alexander not as a predator but as a broken figure caught in the machine of his own making. And for the first time, Alexander saw Isabella not as an enemy but as the only person who could destroy or redeem him. The judge's eyes moved from one side of the room to the other, lingering on Isabella, then on Alexander. Papers shifted, murmurs rose and fell. This was no longer just a legal decision. It was the culmination of everything that had led to this moment. Power, betrayal, guilt, and bloodlines bound under a single roof. Then the verdict came. Custody would not belong to one alone. Joint guardianship. Immediate parental counseling. Oversight by the court. No removal of the child from the jurisdiction without consent. The words landed like stones dropped into a deep well. Neither side had won. Neither side had lost. It was a compromise forged under the weight of public scrutiny and private truths. Isabella's hands tightened around the baby's small back. She felt both relief and dread ripple through her like a single current. Alexander sat motionless, staring straight ahead, his face unreadable but his fists clenched white. The judge's voice faded, replaced by the sound of rain against glass. Reporters scribbled furiously. Lawyers packed up documents. The bailiff opened the doors and a cold gust swept in, carrying the smell of wet pavement and ozone. Isabella rose slowly, holding the baby close, and turned toward the exit. Alexander rose too, but stayed where he was, his silhouette framed by the courthouse's high windows and the storm beyond. For a long moment, they stood separated by an aisle, the baby between them like a living bridge neither had yet learned how to cross. Outside, cameras exploded in flashes. Headlines were already being written. Billionaire forced into joint custody. Fallen heiress regains footing. Storm baby changes everything. The city devoured the story even as it unfolded. But beyond the crowd, something shifted. For the first time since the night of the storm, Alexander didn't send his security detail ahead. He stepped out into the rain alone, letting it drench his suit and smear the perfect lines of his public mask. Isabella, cradling the baby under a thin blanket, paused at the courthouse steps, watching him. He glanced at her just once. A brief flicker, not of dominance or negotiation, but of something softer. His shoulders dropped, his gaze lowered. The man who had built and destroyed empires looked, for an instant, like a father. Isabella turned away, heading toward a waiting car arranged by her lawyer. The baby stirred, opening hazel-brown eyes at the rain. Alexander walked the other way, down the courthouse steps and into the crowd. Cameras followed him, but his expression never changed. He disappeared into the storm, swallowed by gray. High above the city, thunder cracked like a closing curtain. The storm began to break apart, leaving behind wet streets glistening under neon lights. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, marking the hour. Inside the car, Isabella held her child and exhaled. For the first time, she felt something new threading its way through the exhaustion and fear. Not forgiveness, not yet, but possibility. Somewhere else, in a darkened office stripped of staff and power, Alexander stood at the window, watching the clouds break and a pale beam of light slide across the city. The paper with the paternity results still lay on his desk. He tore it in half, then again, until it was confetti on the polished floor. The storm had taken his empire but left him something else, a chance to be human again.